Good morning. I want to start by saying thank you to my committee for the time, attention, and support you have provided me throughout this process. I would not be here today without you. Having read, reread, and read again my research every step along the way, I know you are familiar with my work and the results of my study. But today, I would like to tell you the story of my action research project. This is the story of four teacher candidates, also known as student teachers: Claire, Asher, Harper, and Cora. All four of these teacher candidates have one important thing in common. They are all first year teachers who graduated from the ASU I Teach AZ program in December of this last year. These four teachers were all hired in four different districts within 3 weeks of graduating. But that is how this story ends. To tell their story, I need to back up just a bit to discuss a national problem facing education. Several studies, including some conducted by the Federal Department of Education, indicate that teachers are leaving the profession at alarming rates. Some studies cite that as many as 33% of new teachers will leave the teaching profession within 5 years of starting their career. A review of the literature on the topic suggests that a major reason for this exodus is that early career teachers are not equipped for the demands of the job. So, what is the solution? As a principal committed to the best possible education to all of the students at my school, I need highly skilled, passionate educators in front of my students. The most economic way to accomplish this is to train pre-service teachers well before they begin teaching in the classroom. When pre-service teachers have the skills needed to be successful in the classroom before beginning their career, everyone wins. Students receive an excellent education, and teacher attrition is significantly reduced. Since pre-service teachers are considered adult learners, I began by studying the theoretical framework of Edward Lineman on adult learning theory. Lineman asserts that learning must be meaningful and highly contextualized. As I began working on an intervention to train pre-service teachers, this concept of making learning highly meaningful was a non-negotiable for me. My previous experience training and coaching teachers for 5 years had taught me that adults often learn by seeing and doing. With this in mind, I turned to observational learning theory as articulated by Albert Bandura. Bandura outlines how we learn by watching and mimicking the actions of others, especially in high-stakes situations. The impact that so many teachers leaving the profession has had on my school made me feel that this is a pretty high-stakes situation. Together, adult learning theory and observational learning theory formed the lens through which this study was conducted. All aspects of this research study were aimed at answering the guiding research questions. 1. How do conversations about teaching practices evolve over time between the pre-service teacher participants and the researcher within the context of discussions following peer observations? And 2. How do peer observations influence the teaching practices of pre-service teachers? That first question sounds like a mouthful. Basically, novice teachers tend to talk about teaching in novice terms. Veteran teachers tend to talk about teaching in veteran terms. I wanted to see if pre-service or novice teachers could talk about teaching in veteran terms. I developed a system of peer observation visits as a way to train and develop pre-service teachers. This is where we pick up on the story of Claire, Cora, Asher, and Harper. Over the course of the first semester of this school year, these teacher candidates accompanied me on 3 rounds of peer observation visits, which included dozens of teacher observations. We started with a teacher evaluation rubric that I developed using the Danielson evaluation rubric, which is used in many school districts, as a model. The teacher candidates reviewed this rubric with me and scored themselves using a 5-point scale on 10 different components of teaching. A few weeks later, I observed each of the teacher candidates teaching in their assigned classroom and rated them using the same rubric. About a week after that, all of the teacher candidates met me in my office to begin our first round of peer observation visits. We discussed the impact that planning and preparation has on instructional practices before embarking into the classrooms. We visited 3 classrooms with this focus in mind, pausing after each classroom to discuss what we observed. This process of me observing the teacher candidates individually, then participating in rounds of peer observation visits, was repeated twice more, totaling 3 observations from me and 3 rounds of peer observation visits with the teacher candidates. After all of this was done, I met with each of the teacher participants individually to interview them regarding their experience. Finally, the teacher candidates reflected on their experience by completing a self-evaluation at the end of the study. This study used a mixed methods action research design to study how peer observations affected the teaching practices of pre-service teachers in the elementary school where this study took place. Specifically, a convergence parallel mixed methods design was employed for this study. This type of design involved collecting both qualitative and quantitative data, analyzing the findings independently, then comparing the results. Because this study utilized action research, which is iterative in nature, the data I collected informed the research and innovation as it unfolded. A mixed method design was chosen for this action research study, so I would be able to use qualitative and quantitative data to determine if any complementarity exists between the data sets. Quantitative data from the performance assessment rubric tool and the teacher self-evaluations were analyzed by comparing the level of performance in each of the categories at the beginning and at the end of the study. Descriptive statistics were used to calculate pre-intervention means for each of the 4 domains of the pre-service teacher's self-evaluation, which were compared to the post-intervention means. Likewise, means of the group of data sets were calculated from each of the scheduled observations. The results were compared to determine if the pre-service teacher made progress in pedagogical practices throughout the semester. Basic descriptive statistics were used to present this data. Interviews and post-observation discussions were audio recorded and then carefully listened to multiple times and transcribed. Next, the transcripts from the interviews and post-observation discussions, along with the field notes, were uploaded to NVivo. All qualitative data were analyzed in NVivo using thematic analysis. Each text was carefully read, and open codes were associated with every section of the text. Each text was then reread, and similar codes were combined to make axial codes. The axial codes were analyzed and combined across multiple sets of data. Similar codes were combined to generate themes. This process was repeated several times for each qualitative data set until no new themes could be identified. To make assertions about the research questions, once codes and themes had been determined from the dataset, I considered the themes in concurrence with the results from the other data collection tools. So what happened? Let's look at the quantitative results first. Please open your supplemental materials to the first page and look at Table 4. The self-evaluation document consists of 10 components divided into 3 constructs: planning and preparation, engagement, and discussion and questioning techniques. After an initial orientation to the study, the participants were provided with the self-evaluation document to complete with my help. I explained the attributes of each of the 10 components of the document and asked the participants to score themselves on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 representing no knowledge of the components and 5 representing mastery of the component based on the critical attributes of the rubric. Participants followed a similar procedure at the conclusion of the study, evaluating their perceived self-efficacy of each component of the self-evaluation instrument at the conclusion of the study. As you can see, all participants scored themselves on the self-evaluation at the conclusion of the study, scored themselves higher on the self-evaluation at the conclusion of the study than at the beginning. Claire showed the least overall growth, but also initially scored herself the highest on the pre-self-evaluation. Asher's scores showed the highest degree of perceived growth. Now look at Table 5 in your supplementary materials. The previous chart showed how participants scored themselves. Using the same exact tool, I scored each of the participants using a lesson they taught. I did this 3 times throughout the study. All participants in the study showed growth from the first to the second to the third observation. Asher demonstrated the most growth overall of 1.47 points. Claire had the least growth and the lowest mean scores on the final observation. Claire had 0.67 points growth from the first to the last observation. It is interesting to note that Cora's initial score of 3.92 is higher than any of the participants' final scores. She is a natural teacher. According to both the self-evaluation tool completed by the participants and the performance assessment rubric completed by myself as the researcher, Claire showed the least growth over the course of the study. Cora had the highest discrepancy with the researcher ratings at the beginning and end of the study. Cora had self-evaluation scores of 2.83 and 3.94 respectively on the pre and post assessments. The researcher myself recorded Cora at a score of 3.92 on the first observation and 4.67 on the third observation. It is notable that Cora rated herself lower than the researcher in both cases. Asher had the highest growth on the pre-post test and on the performance assessments. Now let's turn to the qualitative results. Transcripts from the observation rounds, interview transcripts, and researcher field notes all work together to tell the stories of the research participants. The last page of the supplemental materials shows the dominant themes and assertions that emerge from the datasets. I have 5 assertions from this study. The first assertion is that participants applied what they observed in their visits to their own teaching. Harper said, "The observation made me kind of think about, I reflect on my own teaching as I was watching them and think about it, if I do that in my own classroom, how would I handle the situation that they were handling?" While observing other classrooms, Harper was constantly thinking about how to apply the strategies he observed to his own classroom. Later observations of Harper's classroom indicated that he was actually implementing new strategies with success after observing them in other classrooms. This was true of all participants. Classroom management was a specific strategy that was important to participants. Cora reflects on a specific classroom management strategy she observed in a first grade classroom. The idea of classroom management being important to all participants was particularly interesting and surprising to me because it was in no way part of the focus of the visits. I did not bring up classroom management, nor was I trying to teach participants about classroom management, but in each round of visits, classroom management was brought up by every single participant. Reading the transcripts from the observation rounds and the interviews, the next assertion became obvious very quickly. Discussions about teaching and learning became more sophisticated and evidence-based as the study progressed. Here, Claire mentions in an interview a very specific strategy she observed in her classroom. A novice observer may not have noticed how the strategy created equal accountability for all students in the class to participate, but Claire aptly points out exactly how the teacher used the strategy of partner reading to ensure that no single student dominated the learning experience. In the early rounds of observation visits, the participants made extremely superficial observations, which usually began with the stem of "I liked" or "I noticed," followed by an observation of what was happening in the classroom. By the third rounds of visits, however, participants were pointing out very specific strategies that were being used by the teachers. Study participants gained confidence in discussions about teaching and learning as a result of participation in peer observation visits. When asked in an interview the research question, how do peer observations influence your teaching practices? All participants felt more confidence, indicated that they felt more confident talking about teaching and learning with their colleagues and with other teachers on campus. Participants shared that this led to learning new strategies because they did not shy away from conversations about best practices of teaching. In an interview at the end of the study, Cora was beaming as she shared this reflection. People are seeking me out for my perspective and my advice. It's a lot more. I have a lot stronger of a role and presence than I did freshly coming in a few months ago. I've been here for a year now. The semester's amped up like crazy. I feel like I'm really respected. Seems like a strong word, but I feel like people see me as someone that they can get good information from. Finally, study participants perceived peer observation as a valuable learning tool. When asked if participation in peer observation visits had been beneficial, all study participants stated yes. Most even added that they wished pre-service teachers in their program would participate in peer observation visits. Some even continued participating in peer observation visits on their own when the study had ended. Asher particularly enjoyed the visits. After the study ended, Asher was the first to seek out opportunities to observe in other classrooms. Asher shared why this experience was so meaningful to him. He says, participation in the peer observations has been meaningful, very meaningful actually, to my teaching practice because it's given me an opportunity to observe different types of teaching strategies and how they are executed differently by different educators. Because everyone's different in the classroom, and everyone's perception of information is different. Complementarity in this study refers to the extent which the qualitative and quantitative data point to the same outcomes or conclusions. One metric to measure the understanding of various teaching practices used by pre-service teachers was to evaluate the sophistication of their language when discussing teaching and learning. All participants in this study increased the level of sophistication in their language during conversations with the researcher, with me, over the scope of the study. This evolution from simple observations to complex analysis about the observations was seen in the number of times specific strategies were referenced, the change of the phrase I noticed and I liked to more specific observations, and the ability to speak about and engage in conversations about teaching and learning in more sophisticated terms led to better implementation of strategies used by the pre-service teachers' own lessons. The quantitative data from the performance assessment rubric supports that participants are implementing the strategies that they're talking about. We're now on page 76 if you're following along with the dissertation. There were some limitations to the study which are important to note. A major limitation of this study was related to the number of factors that influence a pre-service teacher's growth and development. The goal of this research study was to determine whether peer observations had a real or perceived effect on the pedagogical practices of pre-service teachers as determined by the conversations they have about teaching and learning. While it is certainly the case that all participants demonstrated real growth in the use of effective pedagogical practices, many factors may have contributed to this growth, making it hard to determine the amount of impact that was made by the peer observations as opposed to other factors. Those other factors that may have contributed to the growth of the participants include possible coaching from outside of the study, such as from their mentor teacher or their university supervisor. The sample size of the study may have been another limiting factor. A larger sample of participants would have resulted in a broader range of background experiences among the participants, which may have brought to light other influencing factors that were not accounted for in this study. Researcher bias was a limitation of this study because I served in the role as principal. As a principal, I will continue to use peer observation as a learning tool for pre-service teachers on my campus. of the 4 participants who completed this study, I would feel comfortable hiring any of them to work at my elementary school. Taking what I have learned from the pre-service teachers who participated in peer observation visits, I will expand the use of peer observation to all teachers in my elementary school next year. Because the teachers on my campus have experience teaching and know how to identify specific best practice strategies, I will ask the teachers to help identify an area of focus for each of the visits. Broader implications for practice include teacher preparation programs expanding their program of study to include regular intervals of peer observation using the model presented in this study. Unlike traditional preparation programs that include several semesters of coursework, followed by a single semester of student teaching, the results of this study support a program that includes observation of master teachers integrated throughout a teacher training program. This study confirmed that pre-service teachers at the school in which this study took place valued peer observation as a learning tool for their own professional growth. Further research on the topic would need to be conducted to determine if this is true for other pre-service teachers in the teacher preparation program and if teachers in similar programs would experience the same results. It would be interesting to replicate this study with 2 groups of participants and have one group use video lessons for their peer observation visits. If video observations have the same effect as in-person peer observations, exemplar videos could be used to reach a broader audience of pre-service teachers. Scheduling constraints could be significantly reduced if video observations had a similar impact on pre-service teachers as in-person observations. Teaching is hard work. It is also arguably the most important work in the world. Teachers transmit society's culture. They educate our youth, and they care for the most vulnerable and precious citizens every day. With 17 to 13% of the nation's teachers leaving the profession within the first 5 years, we are facing a national crisis that extends beyond the doors of our schools. American schools need well-trained and well-equipped teachers to do the important work of preparing the next generation to take the reins of society and usher humanity into the next era of progress. A strong society has a foundation of well-educated citizens. Well-educated citizens are created by skillful teachers at all levels of the educational experience. Peer observation has proven to be an effective tool to supplement the training and development of the next generation of teachers. By giving pre-service teachers authentic training through peer observation, these teachers gain the skills necessary to be successful through the most difficult years of teaching and will last long enough in their classroom to perfect their craft and impact thousands of students over the course of a career. Thank you for your time. I now stand for your questions.